Hi, I'm Miss Joan, and today we're going to learn how to make a vermicompost bin. And what a vermicompost bin is an indoor container that holds worms that are going to help decompose your fruit and vegetable scraps. It's nature's way of recycling. So composting normally happens in a forest or a big park like Pilcher Park or West Park. Anything that falls to the ground becomes part of the soil, and it actually gets recycled into being a healthy soil additive. So it happens naturally in the parks. At your home, if you have a garden and the garden scraps fall to the ground, they turn into soil. Some people pick up sticks, leaves, dead flowers, and they put them in a separate container for the garbage man to take away. If you do that at your home, you are already composting. So if mom or dad have a paper bag or a special container and it goes away with the garbage man, most likely it'll end up in Romeoville at the big commercial compost site. So today we're going to look at composting indoors. And first, I'm starting off with a plastic container with a lid, and I've drilled some holes in the top because I told you we're going to have worms living in here, and we need to have air circulation so the worms can live and stay healthy. So what I did prior to coming here is I took my drill and I put a medium drill bit. I don't know what size this is, but it made little holes. I'm going to show you what I did. And I put about 8 to 10 holes in the lid. You can also take the bin itself and put some holes near the top. Don't go down below because then we will have compost coming out of the bin. So once you have your air holes drilled, you want to make sure you get those plastic bits out of there. Make sure it's clean. If you have an old bin at home, it's okay to use it. Just make sure you've cleaned it out, rinsed it out really well, and nothing toxic was in the bin. So, okay, we have our bin. Now we're not going to add the worms yet. We need something for the worms to live in. So something that's very economical that everybody has is paper. We have a paper shredder at work. So paper, believe it or not, is a natural material. A lot of people don't think of paper as coming from nature, but we know paper comes from trees. So it hasn't been changed much by man, and it will decompose or decay over time. You can use brown paper bags, you can use office paper, you can shred cardboard as well. So I'm just going to take most of my paper, not all of it, and I'm going to put it in my bin. If you don't want to spend any money, you can use all paper for your worm bedding. I like to mix the paper shredding with peat moss. Peat moss is found at most garden centers. You can get a great big block of peat moss for about $7, $8, and your parents might already be adding this to the garden to kind of soften up the soil. Now this bag's already been opened, so I'm going to be kind of careful. Peat moss looks a little bit like soil, but it's dry and dusty. Worms don't like to live in things that are dry and dusty, so we have to add water. This is a little messy, so if you choose to do this, you might want to go outside to make your bin. It kind of comes off in big chunks, and I kind of just break it up. My favorite mixture is about half and half peat moss and some type of paper or cardboard. Another reason that we like to use paper is it keeps your bin from getting smelly, and it keeps fruit flies from forming in your bin. Fruit flies often come over time with vegetables and fruit peels. They don't hurt you, they're just annoying. Okay, here's a great big chunk trying to come out. So, there we go. Okay, so I'm just going to break this up. And I'm going to put a little bit more paper in there. And I'm still going to save a little bit more for the end. Okay, this gets a little messy, so you're going to get your hands dirty, unless you can wear gloves as well. The part that gets messy is when you add the water. We know that worms look a little bit like their skin is moist, and it is. It needs moisture. Worms, if they dry out and get too hot, they will die. And I'm going to say that a couple times because if you choose to do this, we want to keep the worms in a shady, cool place. A lot of articles say you can keep them outside, but in a plastic bin, they can cook in the heat. Plastic holds in a lot of heat. So I've got this material mixed. Remember, it's natural paper from trees and peat moss from a garden center. So to make it moist, I filled up a jug full of water. This is the part that gets a little messy. But my fingernails are always dirty because I work in the garden or I'm making up compost bins at work. Okay. Imagine you're a worm and think about whether this is moist enough for you. You can still see it's a little bit dry, so worms aren't going to like that. We also don't want to get it too wet where the worms can drown. If you don't want to use your hands, you can also, if you have extra kitchen spoons, plastic or wooden, and you can devote them to your bin for good, that's a great way to mix this stuff up. Okay. Ideally, you want this about 3/4 of the way filled. You want to leave some room to start adding the fruit and vegetable scraps. And let's talk a little bit more about composting. So we know banana peels, the inside of the apple is a core. Those can go in here. So you need to add them to the top, but you also need to kind of bury them. So those kitchen utensils would work nice, old plastic spoon, just to kind of cover those up. That will help keep your fruit flies under control. And always keep some paper nearby. Either you can cut it up, shred it by hand, or the paper shredder. When you top it off with paper, for some reason, the fruit flies don't fly up. They don't like to come out of the soil, and they just die if there are any. And again, paper is a great deodorizer. It keeps things from smelling bad. So next, why are we throwing these materials into the bin? Well, we're recycling them into compost, which is a great additive for the soil. So if you have a spot in your yard that you're growing a tomato plant, flowers, over time, this material, along with the fruit and vegetable scraps, is going to turn to fluffy, dark soil. It's a great conditioner and fertilizer for the soil. So after this has been sitting with your worms, I forgot to add my worms. That's the most exciting part. Where'd I get the worms? I went to a bait store where they sell fishing supplies, and I bought red worms. We don't want jumbo worms. We don't want night crawlers. We want red worms. So I got these 2 containers at the feed loft in Shanahan, and I just find myself going there because I know about it, it's convenient, and so each of these containers has about 50 to 75 worms. So I'll add 1 container. And you can see they're not the night crawlers. They're not the great big 2, 3, well, they can be 2 and 3 inches long, but mostly they're much smaller than a night crawler. And these guys can live in a container. Night crawlers do not want to live in a container. They want to burrow down deep into the soil. So that's why these are ideal for composting. And they will eat this banana peel in just about 2 weeks. And you want to keep that covered and ideally add a little bit more bedding. As they eat the food, the bedding will go down, and that's why I like the clear containers. You can kind of see the bedding going down as they're eating and turning this to compost. At that point, get your paper or peat moss somewhere nearby, have it on hand, and add a little bit more. You can mix it up ahead of time with some water and just add it to the top. Okay, so over time, just add a little bit more. Sometimes it is okay to just add a little dry peat moss, especially if you know your bin is a little bit wet. You can kind of mix it in and just do a little bit of touching and feeling and see if the conditions are right for the worms. I'm going to add my second container of worms. So we're going to estimate that there's about over 100 worms in here now. What will happen also over time is the worms will have babies, and they will make many, many more worms. My students that I talk to often ask me, how long do these worms live? And when I research that, I get conflicting, amount of time, but anywhere from a year, as long as 5 years, I've heard. So they're going to live, and they're going to make a lot more babies. So over time, you can split this and make a second bin. You can go, and if you have a large Rubbermaid container with a lid at home, you can switch this whole operation over to a bigger bin if you find you really like using the compost bin. And if you like eating fruits and vegetables at home and you have a lot of scraps, it's ideal to put them in this little vermicompost bin. This is the word I've been saying, vermicompost. A lot of people think I'm saying wormy compost, but it's vermicompost, vermicompost. And this is a vermicompost bin. So if you like this idea, you can look this word up on the internet or at the library, and you can learn a lot more about it. And you can become an expert if you want. There's a great book called Worms Eat My Garbage, and ironically, it's by a lady named Mary Applehoff, and she wrote a book, How to Compost Indoors in a Container Like This or Outdoors in Your Backyard. So this is a good word to look up. So I made a little bit of a mess here. We'll just add it to the bin. And like I said, we want to fill this up a little bit more, about 3/4 of the way. And as the worms eat they'll eat the peat moss, they'll eat the paper, they'll eat your fruit and vegetable scraps. As they eat this, you want to add a little more bedding. So when is your compost going to be all done and ready to add to your garden? Probably a good amount of time is about 4 months in a container this size. When this starts turning dark brown and the paper starts disappearing, that means they're eating everything and they're pooping out fertilizer. And that fertilizer is something you want to add to your soil at home. If you got a really hard spot of soil and you want to condition it, or under some special vegetables or flowers, again, that's perfect. So I brought an almost finished batch of compost. And it looks a lot different than this. I've had a big compost bin going in my office at work, and you can see it's turning a lot darker. That means it's getting rich and healthy, and look, it's very fluffy. The longer you leave the worms working on the compost, it's going to get thicker and more wet, and this is fine. And so is real thick, dense type compost. That's fine as well. So what do you do when you get finished compost? What do you do? How do you get your worms out of here? Do you get the worms out? So the best thing that I've done that works for me is I take the finished compost out of doors, wherever I want to put it. I put a piece of plastic down near the garden spot or near the flowers, and I'll put an old tablecloth, or I'll cut a hefty bag open and lay it there on the ground, and I'll actually dump all of this onto the plastic. And I make sure I get some helpers ready. My nieces and nephews will come over, and they love holding and touching the worms. We dump it out on the plastic. They pick out as many worms as they can to start over, and we put them back in the empty bin, and we make them fresh bedding. If a worm gets out and gets into your garden, it'll just live in the soil right there in your garden and help the soil over time. It'll live there instead of in the bin. So this is nature's way of recycling, but we're bringing it indoors to your house. Where should you keep this bin? If mom or dad lets you keep it in the kitchen, it would go great under the kitchen sink. It can go in the basement or a closet or the garage, whatever is convenient for you. Just please keep it out of a hot spot because we want the worms to live and go on for a long time. So that is really vermicomposting 101, and there's so much written about this on the internet and in books in the library that you can learn more if you choose to. It's not hard if you just want to keep it simple. It's an easy little science experiment to get going at home or at school. So I kept a little worm out here, I think, and he's maybe not. Here we go. I'm just going to lay them on the table, and we'll finish off kind of watching them move around. Some people call them red wigglers or red wrigglers. And remember, these are the type of worms that you need to get for this type of compost bin. And they're not bright red, they're just dark red, reddish brown. And remember, people throw away about 20 to 30% of household fruit and vegetable scraps and other organic materials that could be turned into soil instead of left in with the garbage. Over time, they'll start wiggling around even more. As they realize they're out in the open, they're going to start to look for a shady spot. So that is how to make a vermicompost bin, and I hope you enjoyed it today. Thank you.